Hi, I hope you guys are doing really well. Um, I got a message this morning asking if I could break down the difference between concert orchestration and film and game orchestration. So I thought I'd kind of just have a little bit of an unscripted sort of conversation and demonstration about some of the big, differences. Um, I'm going to be talking a lot more about video game orchestration because it's drastically different from concert music, where film is a little more in the middle, and film and game certainly overlap in certain areas depending on which company you work for, which composer you're working for. So, yeah, let's get started. I think the most important thing to understand is the main difference is that we're orchestrating for the microphone. We're not orchestrating for the concert hall. So knowing that you're orchestrating for the microphone means that a lot of the things you learned in, say, Rimsky-Korsakov don't necessarily go out the window, but there are different rules. You could honestly write an entirely different orchestration manual just on orchestrating for the microphone. There are so many just acoustic principles that are just different. So let's get into it. Video game music especially has a need for a hyper amount of isolation, unlike concert music where everyone's in the same room. So in video game music, typically the reason they need separation is music is not linear in some video game music. I work for a lot of different companies. I'm not going to call out any particular companies and their strategies because to protect privacy, and I've signed non-disclosure agreements, so I'm going to be talking globally for different video game companies. So because of the way that the video game engine is structured, it's not linear music, so they might turn on a layer in the brass as the intensity increases. And as an orchestrator, a lot of times I don't know how the video game engine works. I don't know how they're going to sort of take this, Lego kit of orchestration and composition and piece these things together. So my job is to orchestrate what I've been given, make sure it's heard, and make the music sound like them, not like me. So, excuse me. That being said, I'm trying to just show you some of the things that we do, some of the main techniques. So the main thing is that we stripe the music. Very, very rarely do we have everyone in the same room, meaning woodwinds, brass, percussion, harp, strings, choir, in the same room recording. So typically we stripe the sections, which means, the strings come in and then the brass come in for lunch and the woodwinds come in at night or whatnot. And again, we do this for the hyper flexibility because composers, I'm sure if they could, would probably want to have a solo mute button on every single member of the orchestra. Please no one get any ideas, because our job is already complicated as it is. The sort of bad thing about striping is it turns every performance, as Conrad Pope says, into an audition. For me, what I really miss is that there's no alchemy between the players. The overtones aren't getting absorbed into each other and bouncing off of the walls, and the players don't necessarily have a sense of who they're playing with, and I'll get into that in a second, why we do certain things with notation. So for instance, if you have a cor anglais and a trumpet muted and they're playing in octaves or whatnot, like Debussy did in La Mer, if this were concert music, they'd be rehearsing it. They'd know who they're playing with, they would know how to balance, everybody would know who to listen for. Because this is game music, they're seeing this music for the first time in their life, and you have to give them a fighting chance to play the music correctly. and then they're throwing it on the ground and moving to the next cue or whatever. So that being said, what I'm going to just zoom in here. So we overnotate things sometimes, and we give a little more instruction that we wouldn't necessarily do in concert music. So for example, in concert music, it'd be very typical to dovetail instruments. However, because the English horn has no idea where they're fitting in because they're sight reading for the first time, I will typically write take over from the oboe so that they know who to listen for and they're getting the baton from them. So that's this sort of gesture right here. Another thing is we might use the word ghost or color. This is sort of telling the player either to color the instrument that they're with or to just sort of provide a transparent mist behind that instrument that they're accompanying. So something like this, alto, let's say these are alto flutes, you know, pulsing gently. I don't need the clarinet, but just for the sake of demonstration, if I want the clarinetist to know that they're with the flutes, I might write, say, ghost or color flutes or with flutes so that they know who to blend with. Ditto for something like horns. You might have 6 horns playing in unison, and maybe you want the 3rd trumpet to, you know, color it. So you might say color horns or with horns, or you might say maybe all 3 horns are playing, all 3 trumpets are playing with the horns. You might say something like let horns dominate, whatever. So you'll see that a lot in the scores with this, take over from this, hand off to this, color this, etc. Another thing you'll see is a cue, and this is very, very different than your normal classical cue like you see in a part. So a cue is basically like a mute button on a gesture. Cue typically means play only upon request. So, for example, maybe I'm working for a composer I've never worked with before. Maybe they've written something for the oboe in the low register, and I know that it's just going to penetrate and not really give them the color that they're hoping for, that maybe their mock-up, you know, is giving them what they want. So I might cue that gesture in the English horn. If I'm working with someone who I have their trust, I'll just put it in the English horn. But if I don't have their trust and I don't want to get fired, I might cue it in the English horn so when they read through for the first time, or record it rather, and it doesn't work, I might chime in on talkback and say, you know, would you mind trying this on the cor anglais? So that's one way that we use a cue. It's sometimes to fix a problem that we are, you know, anticipating, because that's part of our job. It might be just a color, something to bring out something that's already been written that you just know is going to be great. Another thing we might do is, you know, an ossia, which is sort of like an alternate. So I might do something like let's say this is an open trombone, and maybe I want it to sort of become more like a cimbasso or blend better with the contrabassoon and make the contrabassoon pop. I might just write ossia straight mute, meaning like also straight mute. This is another thing we can try. Okay, so that covers cues. Overdub, that's pretty obvious what that is, so that's done in a separate pass. This is a redundant thing here, but just showing some of the things that we do. And so another thing that you'll see in a lot of John Williams scores is you'll see a lot of markings like expansively and darkly and whatnot. And it's to give the player, you know, a role to get into. And his scores are incredibly detailed and emotional. And I'm not saying that you have to do this, but I certainly don't think it's a bad thing to suggest some of these things to the trombones, you know, darkly, mysterioso, whatnot. So that takes care of a lot of that stuff. Just as far as instrumentation, this is probably going to be a long video. There's just a lot to cover. Typically with the strings, we'll record 2 passes. we might do a pass of a string ostinato, and then the second pass may be melody only, because they need the flexibility to separate a long gesture from a short gesture. It may be one pass is aleatory and another pass is an ostinato, whatnot. You can, string choir versus string quintet, and so on. Excuse me. So as far as layout goes, some of this stuff looks pretty standard. A lot of game companies, they like to start the music on bar 3 rather than bar 1. You'll notice I'm not using bar rests. That's another preference for a lot of composers and players, to be able to write into the parts. Not that the players don't have rests in their parts, because they do, but in the full score. Also, you'll see that we don't use rehearsal marks. We use bar numbers, and they're massive and chunky. This is my template that I use for a lot of scoring. It's a custom Sibelius template, and I've tried to make everything really chunky on the page so it's very easily sight readable. As far as instrumentation goes, especially with film when you're recording in LA or London, or when you've got these big budgets, another difference is that you just have a lot of auxiliaries available to you that you might not have in concert music, like contra-alto clarinet, contrabass clarinet, contrabass flute, oboe d'amore, heckelphone, tube and horn, contrabass trombone, chimbassi, and especially with the percussion, if you're in LA and you're renting from, say, LA Percussion Rentals, you have access to the whole Emil Richards collection, which has all kinds of crazy esoteric percussion. So you'll just see a lot of differences in the instrumentation sometimes. In the middle of the score, you'll see pre-record, and sometimes that's put in the score as a courtesy to the conductor and the composer so that they can see what's happening in the cans, what they're listening to, but what no one else is playing. So they just have a global context of what's going on. Maybe there's a hit in the percussion, and maybe they want to bring that more out in the page. Even though the orchestrator put an accent, maybe they want to make it sforzato, so on and so forth. So I think that's pretty much it for score layout. There's not much else we do differently. We certainly do concert. That's sort of become a standard, because a lot of composers prefer it that way rather than transposed. I orchestrate transposed just because that way everybody's inside the staff for the most part, and you can see where their most comfortable register is. But I deliver scores in concert. And you'll see that we use large time signatures as well. So those are, a lot of the notation conventions. You could make a whole video just on part prep for video game orchestration, and you could make a whole, score layout, a separate video. Another thing I would just say that I'm noticing here is gestures like these. We might, rather than writing, sim, we might just repeat dynamics and stuff like that, because you have to remember we're in the sight reading business. They're seeing this for the first time, and a lot of what you're doing, maybe you're a concert composer or orchestrator and you might see these things as incredibly redundant and maybe insulting to the player. But you have to understand that we're trying to avoid anyone raising their hand and asking a question. And so if I strip these dynamics away, you never know. So it's better to be very, explicit in what you want. So I'm just looking at a list to see what else I can talk about. Let's see here. Well, some performance techniques that are different between concert and video game music. I notice a lot with the strings, things that you might be used to as a concert orchestrator and composer, like writing quadruple stops, like in the style of Beethoven, or double stops or whatever. They don't really play them in video game music. not because they can't. And this was something that used to infuriate me in the beginning. But what they're doing is they don't want to ruin a take. So if they're recording for 2 minutes and all of a sudden your carefully crafted triple stop comes up, and maybe it's out of tune, or you're a double stop that they're trimming or whatever, then they have to stop and do the whole thing over or punch it in. So a lot of times multiple stops go out the window. That doesn't mean I don't write for them, because I do in certain cases, but some things are just simplified a lot. You'll find a lot more specificity in the strings because we're recording for the microphone. There's a lot more front to back, where maybe, we want the back desks to be playing harmonics to color the front desks of violins and whatnot. Maybe, I'm just looking for other things, string counts and stuff, because there's a microphone. So it's just different. We're not thinking so much acoustically and for the audience. So a lot of times when I'm orchestrating, I'm thinking, what's going on in the synths, the pre-record or prelay? Is it a really massive, chunky sound? If it is, maybe I sort of want to thin out the hurt in the strings. Maybe I might want to use Sul Pont and make the strings more of a color on top of this synth, if I know that the strings and the synths are supposed to go together. So that's another thing to consider. Another thing that we do is we get a MIDI file most of the time, almost all the time. And so unless we're writing additional music and we're ghostwriting, which we're doing it from scratch, but we're still writing in a DAW and we're writing in automation. So we will open up the MIDI file in a DAW and we'll look at all of the CC data, and oftentimes we're translating that to hairpins, meaning this stuff here. And I'm also looking at the hairpin data for what's happening in the synths and seeing who's playing with who. And you might say to yourself, well, I think it should be cresce poco a poco rather than a messa di voce up and down every bar. And that's fine, but that might get you fired, because if it's with, say, an omnisphere patch, then they want the CC data and people to be rising and falling in the same place. So that's something else that you have to be incredibly mindful about. I would also just say, looking at some of my notes, like parts, the parts are different. They can be on 9x12 and 10x13, but a big difference is the phrasing of the pages. We tend to not stuff a lot of music onto the page like we do in classical music, and we're using incredibly large fonts because they're further away from the music stand at times. Although nowadays with COVID, everyone's getting their own part, unless that's changed, I don't know. So, yeah, I would say these are a lot of the main differences. And if anyone would like me to expand further, this is already like an 18-minute video. So I hope this is helpful in just sort of explaining some of the differences between concert and film and video games. The only thing I would say with films, a lot of the similar things apply, is maybe film doesn't always have as much need for hyper focusing different groups and mutes, although they certainly stripe. I've just noticed with video games that there might be 2 passes of strings, where films might just be 1 pass of everything and they stripe. So anyways, I really hope this is helpful, and let me know if there's anything else you guys would like me to talk about, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day or evening or morning wherever you are. Thank you so much.